And good morning and welcome to the second meeting of the Net Zero Energy and Transport Committee for 2024. We have formal apologies from Monica Lennon, and on that basis I'm pleased to welcome Sarah Boyack, who is attending this morning as the Scottish Labour Party substitute. First item on the agenda is a declaration of interest, and that's to invite Sarah to declare any relevant interests in relation to the committee and this evidence session. Sarah, welcome. And do you have any interests you want to declare?
Thank you, Convener. If you look at my register of interests, you'll find a number of organisations I'm a member of which have declared. But I think the main thing for declaration today is that I was actually the Cabinet Secretary that introduced the Transport Scotland Act 2001. Just for people's interests. Thank you, Convener.
Okay, thank you. That's interesting. And I should also say that the Deputy Convener, Ben McPherson, is on his way, but is struggling slightly with conditions getting here, but may miss the first part of the session. So, having done that, move on to agenda item 2 is a decision on taking business in private, and this is a consideration whether to take item 7 in private. Item 7 is a consideration of the evidence that we'll hear today on environmental governance in Scotland. Are we agreed to take that item in private? We are agreed. Our next item of business is agenda item 3, is the consideration of a draft statutory instrument, the Bus Services Improvement Partnership Objections Scotland Regulations 2024. For this item, I'm pleased to welcome Fiona Hislop, the Minister for Transport, and the Minister is joined by Liana Vatislova, and who's a lawyer for the Scottish Government, and Osoya Kerry, if I haven't got the pronunciations right, I always struggle a wee bit, and I apologise. So if I've been clumsy, forgive me, who is a Bus Regulatory Policy Manager for Transport Scotland, and Bettina Seisland, the Director of Bus Accessibility and Active Travel for Transport Scotland. Thank you very much for joining us today. Following this evidence session, the committee will be invited at the next agenda item to consider a motion calling for the committee to recommend approval of the draft instrument. And I just remind everyone that the officials can speak under this item, but not in the debate that follows. Minister, I think you want to make a brief opening statement, and please go ahead.
Thank you and good morning, Committee, and thank you for inviting me to discuss the Bus Services Improvement Partnerships Objections Scotland Regulations 2024. The Transport Scotland Act 2019 was designed to help make Scotland's transport network cleaner, smarter and more accessible than ever before. For bus specifically, it provides an enhanced suite of flexible options for local transport authorities to improve bus services according to their local needs. The 2019 Act offers wider powers for local transport authorities to run their own services, as well as providing viable options for partnership working and franchising. Bus Service Improvement Partnerships, or BSIPs as they're known, provide a formal form of partnership working between local transport authorities and bus operators, with both sides working together to develop a partnership plan and related schemes to improve services in their area, jointly taking responsibility for delivery. Now, once a Bus Services Improvement Partnership is in place, all operators in the area are required to meet the service standards it sets out, regardless of whether they supported its development. As such, the objection process is key to ensuring that bus operators in an area are able to meaningfully engage with the BSIP, as it provides a mechanism for them to object to the proposals. This ensures that the final partnership is based on mutual agreement and buy-in from both the transport authorities and operators, so they can serve the needs of local communities. The regulations under consideration today prescribe who can object to a BSIP when it is being made, varied or revoked, and the minimum number of objections needed to pause or halt the proposals. The local transport authority can only progress with the proposal if a sufficient number of operators do not object. This is intended to balance the right of local transport authorities to bring forward a BSIP against the right of operators to object to what is being proposed. proposed. In developing these regulations, we have sought to account for the significant variations in local bus markets across Scotland and considered the wide range of possible scenarios in which a BSIP may be developed. We have also sought to ensure that no single operator is able to have an undue influence in relation to a BSIP. We have engaged closely with key stakeholders such as local authority, transport officers and operators. Their involvement in the development of the mechanism and these regulations has been crucial in creating a practical approach which is designed to flexibly address local needs. These regulations are a key part of creating successful partnerships between local transport authorities and operators to improve services for passengers, and I'm happy to answer any questions that members may have.
Thank you very much, Minister. I'm going to get the first question. So I seem to remember in 2019 when we were looking at the Transport Act that was going through at the time, there was quite a lot of support for local bus companies to be established by local transport authorities. And we heard, if I remember rightly, that Lothian Buses was an anomaly, which has resulted as the fact that the law hadn't been complied to in relation to their disbandment and then the privatisation. So there's encouragement to do it, but there's no money. There's no money in the budget this year. So how are local transport authorities going to do it if you're not going to give them any money, considering the huge costs?
So that's not quite the case. If we can maybe set out, you referred to Lothian Buses, which is obviously a municipal bus company with ownership by the local authority. These regulations are not anything to do with that. That's obviously...
I accept that.
Yeah,
I'm asking about other local transport authorities and how they're going to take this, this plan forward if you don't give them any money.
So we are. So if you can let me continue, Convener. So the Transport Act provides for local authorities to run their own bus companies, like Lothian Bus Partnerships, which are the subject of these regulations, and also, thirdly, develop franchises. The funding that supports these aspects of the 2019 Transport Act to which you are referring, the support for developing policies in relation to this is still in the budget. It comes under the Community Bus Fund, which has £1 million set aside for 24-25 in revenue and £5 million in terms of capital. So your question is, does the budget support the work of the Transport Act? Yes, it does, and that's the mechanism by which it does so. In terms of in relation to funding for bus, there is and continues to be funding for bus in relation to the Network Support Grant, which primarily goes to support the operation of the for bus services. And also in relation to buses, in terms of funding, you've also got the concessionary scheme, which has got a small uplift as well. So in relation to support for the operation of buses, that funding is still there and is still fully funded as it was previously in relation to 23-24.
Okay, I wasn't going to get into concessionary funding because we know that only funds a proportion of the actual costs of it. I'm looking at actually local transport partnerships having the money to create their own buses. Now, the bus company, what I'm saying is that I don't think there's much money in there. You said there's £5 million, I think, in capital. I can't remember the cost of a bus, but I mean, that's not even 15 buses, is it?
In relation to buying buses, that would be a capital fund. It is not necessarily the responsibility for us to fund local authorities to buy buses. We have funded and supported them significantly to transfer buses within their local area. Obviously, you've indicated Lothian operates in a different model than others to transfer from diesel to become more, have electric buses, etc. And in the case of Aberdeen Hydrogen, so that has happened, but it's been in relation to bids and capital funding. I think you're talking about the operation of buses themselves. In relation to local authorities, they have responsibilities to help when there's a problem, particularly when we have seen that in different areas of some operators pulling out, and there has been spend of about £55 million by local authorities. That's part of the local government settlement. So in terms of the development of the powers within the Transport Act, what I would say is that local authorities are interested in different models. They're trying to take forward that work. It's primarily about policy work. They'll have to take it through their own committees when they come up with their own solutions, etc. But in terms of that policy work and that development, the funding is there as it was previously. Are all these local authorities going to do everything overnight, as in set up everything next year, in terms of what your question is about the 24-25 budget? I'm not aware of the pace of that being such that there would be major demands on the 24-25 budget.
Well, I'm sure local authorities will have a view on where they're going to struggle to find that money from. But Mark, you want to come in, I think, on this, do you? Mark?
Yeah, thanks, Convener. I was interested in the Minister's comments there about the Community Bus Fund. I mean, it's a modest amount of money that's been allocated, but I'm interested in which local authorities are taking up that opportunity, particularly on the revenue side, to do that business case work, looking at the options around franchising and municipalisation, and whether those are predominantly rural local authorities or urban. I think it'd be useful to get a sense of how local authorities are responding to that money that's available and what work they're doing.
Okay, again, the discussion on this is not in relation to the regulations that are in front of us. I think if everybody acknowledges that this is, you're going more widely than the regulations that are here. In relation to the developments, I might bring Bettina Seisland in if she can give more information. My understanding from my discussions with different transport authorities, I think it's quite clear to I think it's really important. I think the conveners referred to himself that a lot of these issues are driven by local authorities themselves. I know that Swestrans have got interests. I spoke to them, had a meeting with them about 2 weeks ago as to the different models they've got. They're still working that up. They expect, I think it was in the summer, they gave indication that they, and I don't want to speak for them because obviously they're an autonomous body, but they were, they have been working up considerations of the type of scheme that they would want to have. I know that Highlands are particularly interested in different models again. So I think that's quite interesting. Is like you've got rural areas in particular taking forward work on that area. I know that Glasgow, and of course you've got the wider issue of the other local authorities and their transport authority are interested in. I know that there's been talk. I don't know how, again, the detail on it because it's not my direct responsibility. We give them the enabling powers within the Transport Act to take that forward. But there's obviously strong lobbying in different areas for a franchise model in Glasgow, but perhaps Bettina might bring these are all early stages and all the local authorities would acknowledge that, so that might address the issue of, in terms of the funding that's available for the next financial year, as was the question, the initial question. Bettina, is there anything you've got to add?
Yeah, I mean, we received a number of bids from local authorities and regional transport partners for use of the RDL to explore their transport app powers. I don't have the list of the bidders in front of me, so what we do is we write to the committee and provide that information.
Thanks, Mark. I'd just like to ask, have Transport Scotland officials engaged with UK counterparts, especially those in Greater Manchester, to learn about the development of bus franchising in major metropolitan areas in England?
Yes, we have. We're in contact with both DfT colleagues and colleagues in Manchester to understand what their experiences have been through as they develop their franchising arrangements.
Okay, thank you for confirming that. Can you tell me what it's proven? What's come of it?
I think it's still early days for them, so we're still learning with them.
Okay, it doesn't appear I'm going to get much further on money or on that, so I'll go straight to Jackie Dunbar with the next question.
Thank you. And I think part of my question's already been answered by the Transport Minister, and good morning to you all. Sorry, being a bit rude. It was regarding the powers allowing local authorities to establish the bus companies. You've already said that some have already started in discussions. Why do you think that some aren't? Do you think there's a reason behind it? And what can or will the Scottish Government do to try and help those that are keen to establish a bus company moving forward?
So there's three different models. There's the bus company, there's the partnership, which is the kind of the regulations that you've got before you is about the objections to setting up that in a more formal way, and the third is franchising. So there's those three different models. In terms of what we can provide, it might help in terms of relation to the last question. We do expect to provide more guidance help, in terms of that sharing of best practice that will have been learned from elsewhere, in terms of these different models. In terms of the bus companies, setting up their own bus companies, it is really early doors for them, and it's up to them. It's not actually up to us. I mean, we would keep a watching brief, as you would as a company, as the committee provide that. But I think that really is an issue that you might want to ask the transport officers or COSLA or the companies themselves. I think it's important to say that there are different bus markets in different areas, and some of them are stronger, dare I say, than others. And in terms of, we know the patronage of buses has not recovered to the level it has, and many local authorities obviously rely on private operators. In fact, the vast majority, apart from, as referred to, Lothian, rely on private operators. So obviously there's a bit of a tension if companies want to set up their own bus company, because obviously that then acts in competition. There's obviously competition law issues in and around this as well in relation to bus operators. So at the same time as they're absolutely mutually dependent just now in terms of sustainability of bus services right across between all the different operators and companies, some local authorities may want to take that step to set up their own companies. The Transport Act allows them to do that, but those steps that they will need to take forward, and they all need to have confidence that they, as local authorities, are in the position to be able to do that. And that's for them, that's not for us. We can try and keep a watching brief on it, and that's what we would do. And when I visit, and I've visited a number of local authorities, they can share with me what they're, the state they've got to and the steps that they're taking. But again, that's for them, and it really isn't for me to account for them in this committee, because I don't want to misrepresent them in any way.
Okay, thank you.
Bob, I think you wanted to ask a supplementary on this, so on you go.
Yeah, just briefly, apologies, Minister, rewinding the clock back slightly in relation to franchising. I know there's a little bit of mission drift in some of the questions, but just for my own clarity here, Minister, clearly we have to learn lessons of elsewhere in relation to franchising, but my experience in Glasgow has been that there are some very profitable routes. So I can think of the 61 buses in my constituency. We can pack them in, the bus is always full and there's a high frequency of service, but after a certain time at night, the 8 or the 90, you can't get it, and there's connectivity issues in my constituency. So quite often what happens is those routes are subsidised, and I think the Minister mentioned £55 million worth of subsidies. So I suppose my substantive question, Convener, would be that if franchising was to roll out in a meaningful way and routes were bundled as part of that franchising process, should we expect to see that public subsidy through other areas where bus companies withdraw from a service because they have no compulsion to continue to offer a commercial service there and require public subsidy? Should we see a shift in that relationship with franchising? Has there been modelling work in relation to that? Not for answer today necessarily, Minister, but I'm keen to better understand that relationship, because I think that's central to a lot of it.
So I think what you're trying to set out was, and I'm not familiar with the different local buses and the numbers you refer to, but the
I wasn't grilling you on that, Minister.
But the principles of it, I think, are probably achieved by both formal bus partnerships and also franchising, because you're trying to set out something that is more sustainable. Just now, in terms of the financing of the bus market, you've got a situation where there's a huge amount of money going in concessionary travel, but it was set up in the previous legislation so that it was on a no worse off, no better off aspect. It does help patronage, and hopefully then, as we discussed previously, younger people, for example, will become actual peer feeing, fare paying passengers as they go on. But that point you're saying, it allows that, and I've heard that discussion, and I've had that discussion with councils in Glasgow, is that kind of what franchising can do is the bundling of it can enable the geography of an area to be complete, because as we all know, there are certain times of the day that buses are more popular than others, and you can understand the position, because remember, we are in a deregulated market that's been deregulated for a long time, that private operators, obviously as private operators, need to ensure that they are making some kind of profit in terms of the viability of their services. So therefore it's more attractive to do certain routes rather than others. Now that it has led to local authorities having to pick up the pieces, dare I say, in terms of those areas where buses have been withdrawn in particular ways. And I think the whole point of the Transport Act, and also what we can try and do in relation, I hope, with the Fair Fares Review, which is due, and I've written to the committee that we're expecting that imminently, but to try and provide more sustainability in the system, because I think that's what we need for bus services, because if we're going to get more people back onto bus, they need to know that they've got a sustainable, reliable services, and at different times of the day, because people we know are working in different shift patterns, etc. So in answer to your question, will this help in address the problems you've got? My answer would be yes, not necessarily just in franchising, but if it was built into the bus partnership, for example, and the schemes that come as a result of that, that would be possible as well.
And going forward, Minister, do you think the subsidy levels, if you like, where the commercial sector withdraws, but it's tendered and replaced again in a subsidised level, those subsidies, is that something worth tracking over time? Because if these partnerships and the franchise is successful, then a sustainable model wouldn't see that subsidising done in that way. It would be done in a more kind of proactive, strategic way.
Ideally, yes, but I think the pressures in the bus market, particularly coming through the pandemic with the reduced numbers of people using the bus service, is challenging that. So that's why I think it's more important than ever that we look at, or local authorities do, look at models that can help provide that that reliable, sustainable service in their area that is less reliance on subsidy, because actually over the piece there's enough income. But that also includes trying to increase patronage as well.
Okay, thank you.
Douglas, I think you've got some questions now.
Thank you, Convener, and morning, Minister. Really just to ask what the Scottish Government are doing to support the rollout of bus priority measures, especially on the trunk road network, where Scottish ministers have direct control over.
That's a very good and important question. We have supported bus priority measures in the last number of years. You'll be very familiar with the Aberdeen system, and understanding that the bus gates are in operation. I also understand that the local authority with the local bus company are looking to provide free bus services during the weekend, which I think again is a very proactive measure, which I think is part of a more complete area. In terms of funding, this is where, and I think the convener is obviously in the convener's in conversation, but the convener was asking about funding in the budget. The Bus Priority Fund, which helps address some of the congestion issues and the capital issues, I would also refer that is the area that we will not be able to fund next year. It has been paused. We know that the consequences of a very severe budget reduction in terms of capital that the Scottish Government has received. We know that we're going to have 10% less capital funding over the next 5 years. The Scottish Fiscal Commission has itself reported to the Parliament they expect that reduction will be the value of 20% over the next 10 years. So decisions have had to be taken in terms of our capital budget within transport. And the one area that we'll see a market change for next year, it's paused, it's a longer term commitment we want to try and restore, but the Bus Priority Fund that funds the issue, for example, like bus lanes and bus gates, that has been paused for next year, and there isn't funding for that. All those plans that are in place that have been agreed will continue to be funded in 23-24.
So if I can, because part of that, the question was also to ask about, obviously there's no money in the Bus Partnership Fund for the coming financial year. So if we look at the government's commitment about getting more people onto public transport. Why was that part of the budget chosen to be cut, zeroed, actually, Minister? Why was that chosen and not something else?
So again, that's an important question for the committee to consider in your wider budget scrutiny, and that I know that you've got the Cabinet Secretary appropriately coming in to discuss the wider bus issues. In terms of this one, if you think about the wider budget area, we have to keep our safety as paramount in terms of road and also in terms of rail. So that's the bulk of our funding in terms of our operations. Similarly, as you know, in terms of ferries, we have lifeline ferries. We have to make sure that they continue to be supported to provide that service. Additionality, which is what this is about improving. You're right to identify, and I hope you're expressing support for the work in Aberdeen that has seen those bus gates and that change in that city centre completely to try and encourage more people in. That was a good scheme that came forward and came forward, I suppose, quite promptly. In terms of other schemes, they've probably come in terms of ready to be invested in schemes a bit slower than we might have anticipated. But they're also these are additional projects. They're not legally contracted. They're not financially contracted. They're not. They're highly desirable, but in a tight budget settlement with 10% cut in terms of capital overall for government, tough choices have had to be made. And although the Bus Partnership Fund is paused for next year, we would want to continue it, because you're quite right in terms of trying to encourage more people to use buses, freeing up lanes to ensure that you've got more reliable buses so people then can start to use it and increase the patronage is desirable. But I'm afraid I can't come with, and I've been an MSP for a long time, and I remember all the budgets when people had additional funds that they could then, the questions were about why are you giving additional funds, more additional funds to them and less additional funds to other areas. It was all about additional funds. We can't have additional funds in the financial climate we've got just now. So it's regrettable, but I think it's understandable in the circumstances.
So, Minister, can I just clarify in terms of the Bus Partnership Fund, was it a case that there really wasn't the demand into that fund, maybe from local authorities, or was it just that there was sort of projects coming forward, it's just that the government chose to not spend that money in that area next year?
I suspect it's a range of different factors. I was struck when I came into government that there was less of worked up ready schemes, not that there wasn't a lack of demand, but there's obviously a lot of work. I mean, you'll know that from the experience in Aberdeen. There's a lot of work has to go into the preparation, because it's not just a case of designating a lane. There's a lot of planning issues around that. There's a lot of there's an engineering work within it. There's a lot of actually preparatory work involved in that. So it's not that there's a lack of desire in that, and I know a number of local authorities will want to do that, and we actually are honouring all the schemes that come in for bidding. But I think it's an issue that people want to do it, but the pace of implementation, they may have other priorities. It may, there are challenges in particular areas. So there'll be a number of different factors for different local authorities. But I think, again, Bettina, you might have better insight into the types of schemes that have been coming in and the pace of which they're coming in. So
I think, as the Minister says, there weren't as many construction-ready projects as we anticipated, or quick wins. And so we've had to take the time with the 11 informal partnerships to develop those schemes and go through the appraisal work and carry out the public consultation, because most of those are being, if you like, retrofitted into existing road space. So they do need quite a lot of local conversation as well as technical appraisal work before they can be ready to be delivered. And that's taken some time.
So in terms of that 500 million commitment, Minister, is that still a commitment that's ongoing? What was the timescale for that commitment when it was made?
So it was, I think, set out initially in 1920. Obviously, the pandemic overtook a lot of issues, and so a lot of things weren't progressed. It is a longer-term commitment. I am not in the position to be able to tell you how long and for when that will be, but it is a... we can't, because of the financial situation that we're in. I think everybody recognises that for a whole variety of different reasons, the UK and subsequently the Scottish Government's financial position is not nearly as strong as it was prior to, certainly, well, a number of incidences which I won't relay just now, but even since 2019-20. So what I can reassure you on is I know that increasing and improving bus patronage is important for a whole variety of reasons. One, because people need it for their jobs, etc. But for climate change as well, that's the shift that we have to take. So can I assure you that I will continue to make sure that we can reinvest in this area? The answer is yes, but I can't do it next year.
Okay, thank you, Minister. I'll move on from capital to revenue, really, for my next question. And in terms of the budget for next year, the network support grant is 11% less than it was for 23-24. And the rate per kilometre travelled is not being increased either. So how do you justify reducing support for the provision of bus services when, as we all agree, increased bus travel is vital for us to meet our climate change targets?
So that's a very good question, but I can answer it by assuring you that the network support grant has been fully funded. What that means is we've worked with the bus operators to identify, and it's done by a kilometres rate, and in relation to what they have experienced in the last year and what they anticipate experiencing this year, this is continuing to fund it at a similar rate. Now, what this means is that last year, the network support grant probably didn't get drawn down as much as anticipated because of the reduced patronage numbers, and also, as we know, in a number of local authority areas, bus services were actually cut, so the funding for that wasn't needed. So if I can reassure you that the funding from last year, this was in this current year, will be and has been reinvested back into bus services. But going forward for 24-25, the network support grant is fully funded, albeit at a reduced rate, because the demand and need for it is not as much as was anticipated, because unfortunately some bus companies have reduced their routes, which means in terms of the formula basis that's used, they won't need as much, and so therefore that's the explanation. So it's still fully funded and it's stable. It's just at a different level than we would have had anticipated because of the reduced patronage and routes in some areas.
So just to clarify, Minister, for my understanding, that the money is being reduced for the network support grant because we've actually got less buses and less routes. Is that a fair comment?
Yeah, I think that's fair, and that's why we need to, and I think this is the critical question facing the bus services, find means by which we can have greater sustainability in the bus service, because it has been weakened because of the pandemic and the numbers of passengers hasn't returned to rate, which also makes some services more vulnerable for what are private operators in a deregulated bus market.
And sorry, I'll just briefly. And so, has there been analysis done on that, Minister? Why there is less routes? Is it because people are using trains, for example, or is it they're staying in their cars, or they're working from home? Is there any analysis done at all? So there has been, and we can try and identify how we can share that with you. The Confederation of Passenger Transport have also done work themselves. It's particularly in relation to an age profile, actually. Over 60s in particular haven't returned. We also know that some people will be, the working patterns and transport patterns have changed completely. So the weekends are now, in fact, the busiest day for transport in rail, for example, is Saturday. Lothian buses, when I visited them, were telling me how Sunday is becoming more of a travel day because people want to visit family, etc. Weekends are busier. That may be, and I think is a consequence of maybe more people working from home during the week, so they do want to get out and about at the weekend. So there's quite a variability of behaviour within the bus system that everybody's looking to try and analyse. But the consequences, particularly in terms of the reduction, is in the older age group. Now that also, and again, I don't want to sort of anecdotal, but there's these are areas that I know that the bus academics, bus researchers looking into, is whether that age profile is more a reluctance to be out and about more after having had, what was a kind of very serious experience of a pandemic when you were probably used to not going out as much, and how that's affected. So there's a number of different reasons. Also, and again, it comes back to that sustainability of the market. Remember, you had fuel price increases as well. And that will have hit a number of
transport authorities, not least obviously bus operators as well. So in terms of profitability of routes, so there's a bit of a knock-on impact of reliability, sustainability, which is why I am very keen as Minister to address that issue. And that's one of the things that when I hope I get a chance to come back to the Committee on the Fares Fair Review, how we can try and openly, because this is not just, you know, for this government, it's for any government in the future. How do we ensure that we have a sustainability of our bus system going forward?
Okay. Thanks, Commissioner.
Thanks. Bob, I think you might have some a further question. Then I'm going to come to Sarah. And Sarah, if you want to bring up any points that you've just heard in that session, that would be your chance to do it, Bob.
Yeah, thank you very much, Commissioner. Minister, just again on the funding going into bus services in Scotland, there's a significant financial commitment. It's £429.7 million, but I am conscious that £370 million of that is concessionary travel, be that for under 22s or over 60s and some other groups. So I'm just wondering whether or not there's any unintended consequences of such a significant split of investment between concessionary travel and the wider funding of bus services, and what the rationale is from government of doing that, and whether there's a relationship between, I'll just bundle them together, Convener, whether there's a relationship between that and what we've all sometimes seen from time to time in our constituencies, and that is certain routes being less commercially viable and the withdrawal of certain services. So is there a relationship between the increasing of that concessionary schemes, the massive public investment in that? Is there a relationship between that and some services being less commercially viable, if you like, elsewhere?
So if I can maybe caveat, this is my overview as Minister, as opposed to being able to give you concrete correlation and evidence. There is a relationship, I think. The more you have funding for concessionary travel, you're then limiting the market for what you might call full fare paying passengers. If you have a concessionary fare scheme that's based on a system where bus operators are no better off and no worse off, and you have 2 million people using concessionary fare, that obviously means there's less scope for them to rely on full fare paying passengers in terms of funding for their services. And you're right. I mean, we are probably disproportionate in terms of the amount that we do fund concessionary fare and free bus travel anywhere internationally. Because that's, and again, I don't want to preempt what you'll see in the Fares Fair Review. That's a considerable amount. Now, again, I've said to this committee, I mean, a test of what is an extremely popular measure, which is helping families address the cost of living, which is the under 22 free bus travel. That's good in and of itself, as is the concessionary fare for older people for good social reasons, economic reasons within families, etc. But the challenge is, how do we use public funding, which is a considerable amount, and when you add in the other bus funding that we're providing, that you're talking about £500 million, is there a way we can better use that to provide more sustainability of bus services? Because clearly it's great if you have a free bus pass and you're under 22, but if you live in certain parts of the country and you don't have the bus services to go on, it's not as great a benefit as it might be for Glasgow or for other parts of the country. So are there unintended consequences? I think over the piece there has been. That's why, working with the committee, I'm quite keen to look at that overall sustainability and reliability of the bus market to ensure that we can have a better use of public funding to help to support that. So that's a general view with you. I think in terms of looking at the evidence you want, I think the Fares Fair Review will provide that in a more concrete way for you once it's published.
Thanks, Minister. Just a slight reflection and follow-up question. Just, you're right, I can't deny as an urban MSP there will be clearly unintended consequences for some remote and rural areas, but I would put an appeal in densely populated urban areas. You've got large volumes of young people in school, children going to certain travel routes as well, and within cities there can be unintended consequences also, so it's not simply a remote and rural issue. I think it's worth putting on that record as a city MSP. But are you effectively, I think, Minister, saying that in a few years' time we'll be nudging £500 million public investment
I think that's something that every MSP within the Parliament should be thinking about.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Bob. Sarah, you've got some questions.
Yeah, fascinating to come in off the back of that set of questions, because I didn't declare it, but of course I introduced the first free bus travel for the over 60s in Scotland, and it is interesting to see the extent to which members of the public are now using concessionary bus passes for their over 60s or the under 22s. And it's really to follow up on that about the Scottish Government's strategy and funding streams to ensure that we do actually have more and more people using buses, because as colleagues have pointed out, we've lost a lot of bus services over the last few years. So in terms of today's piece of work around bus service improvement partnerships, what analysis have you done in terms of the benefits of BSIPs versus bus franchising and the costs and benefits of the different options? One thing that feels clear is the resource issue for local authorities to choose what to do, whether it's BSIPs, as you mentioned, or bus franchising. It's a start-up cost for this and then the ongoing costs. So have you got a cost-benefit analysis that you could share with us about the choices to increase the modal shift?
Okay. So in terms of development, I mean, you'll understand that I wasn't the Transport Minister who brought through the 2019 Act, and there's been, as the committee has pointed out, a number since then as well. But in terms of the different models, the choices that local authorities face will be exactly what the member said. Some will want to take on full so bus ownership aspects and implementations, and many look obviously at the Lothian system, and some will want to look at franchising, and some will look at bus service improvement partnerships, which may more reflect some of the informal bus partnerships that currently exist, which may require less, I suppose, resource funding. And I think you're referring is not just the capital resource, because in that operation you're still dealing with buses that are primarily owned, potentially leased in the future, etc., or leased just now. But it's the people resource for local authorities to run those partnerships. Now, remember, local authorities are local transport authorities already. They have significant departments that already run their kind of transport work themselves, but that's a decision they'll make. But Bettina, can you look back historically, looking at the different models, what work has been done, and obviously the part of that is sharing the best practice that we've had and looking at other parts of the country, the rest of the UK, that's looked at different models to see what the cost-benefit aspect, and which is why people are interested in Manchester, but there are negatives on that as well. I think they themselves said in terms of the amount of resource time it took some time aspects to set up that, and it's not all just easy sailing. There are challenges within that. So that's the sort of information we do want to share. And also in terms, as I said, of the guidance that will be coming out later on this year, we'll address some of these issues as well. Bettina? Yeah,
the work today is focused on the regulations and the legislation that's required to give local authorities the powers to look at the different arrangements that might be appropriate in their local areas. So these are very much tools for the local authorities to use. As the Minister said previously, it's the Community Bus Fund that provides a bit of resource for the local authorities to look at the cost benefits in their particular area of using the different powers. So that's the level at which we would expect the cost benefit to be taken up.
Have you done the actual analysis of the different costs of increasing modal shift? Because we've lost so many bus services. It's partly how you stabilise and sustain bus services, as the Minister said, but also about creating new services that attract people, which could be timings or it could be routes. Because the Community Bus Fund is £1 million. So is there something about the start-up cost to get this going that's the block, having introduced that 2001 Act? having the powers available but actually using them is a huge gap here.
So two aspects to that. The overall modal shift, there will have been work done, and we can look at what we have in terms of the cost benefits and modal shift. But I would also say in terms of the individual areas, that's exactly, and it's interesting, the conversation I had with Swesttrans, that's exactly what they're looking at themselves, the different models and the cost benefit. That's actually their work, because remember, there isn't a one-size-fits-all in Scotland in terms of bus. I think that's the challenge. So it wouldn't necessarily be for me as Minister to set that out. That would be for the local authorities themselves and the transport authorities who have the legal responsibility in their local area to look at that. But what is really important is that they have the ability to kind of share what their analysis is, because although Highland might be different from Dumfries and Galloway, for example, there may be similarities. And Bob Doris talked about remote and rural. I don't like using the word remote. It depends from where you're starting from. As to, a lot of people think Glasgow is remote, for example. But one of the biggest challenges is semi-rural as well. It's not just what you might say more dispersed communities in terms of geography and land and availability of buses. Semi-rural can also have, and some of the dynamics and the market working of areas that are relatively close to cities can be more problematic even than more rural areas.
So just a final, because we have to move on. Have you done an analysis of how many routes you think will be saved or added through using Bus Priority Fund partnerships? What's the analysis in terms of modal shift?
So it's not bus priority partnerships. It's bus services improvement partnerships,
Sorry,
which is
yeah.
No, I don't know. I mean, I think
sorry, I was using the fund.
Too many of these names are similar. The bus partnership fund is not about saving bus services. It's, as was discussed with Douglas Lumsden's, it's actually about making it more convenient. So I think there may be a correlation that if you actually make more bus lanes that allow Aberdeenshire, for example, people in Aberdeenshire to get into Aberdeen more quickly and more reliably, you could save potentially services in Aberdeen. But actually that really is an analysis. That is really a job that the local transport partnership and authorities will exactly do, to say, actually, if we can get more people from Aberdeenshire coming into Aberdeen using these bus gates, it's becoming more reliable. We know that the patronage in Aberdeen has gone up. That's good. It's why I'm frustrated that, unfortunately, because of the financial settlement, the 10% cut in our capital budget, the escalation of inflation, construction costs, putting pressure on the transport budget, that we're having to pause that bus the bus priority fund that we discussed earlier on, because I do think it will help. Your point about does it save buses, save routes, that's not necessarily the purpose of it. Unintended or so consequential is it may well do that, because it's about sustainability of buses, and it's the sustainability of the market that I think will help save the routes. But it's actually, I mean, even in relaying this, you'll see it's a very complex area, and every single part of Scotland will have a different experience, and the cost benefits of it will be different to different parts of the country.
Okay, I think Mark Ruskell has got the final question.
Yeah, thanks. It's been an interesting evidence session, and I suppose I was just reflecting on the amount of in the number of my constituents who write to me every week with concerns about the quality of services, not just about whether services are running or not, but whether they're running on time, whether buses are breaking down. So I wanted to ask you about the conditionality that's applied to public sector funding, because I think that Jenny Gilruth, as a previous Transport Minister, announced that there was going to be a review of bus sector funding, and that as part of that there would be consideration about what conditionality can be applied to that funding. So obviously we've got the Traffic Commissioner that's able to hold some of the bus companies to account, but I'm interested in what work the government's done to make this substantial investment in the bus sector every year conditional on some basic standards of service and improvements going forward.
So I remember being part of this, a member of this committee when that was previously discussed, and how do we use what is a considerable amount of grant funding that comes in this area to try and deliver the changes that we want in terms of particularly Fair Work First. So we're working through all the different funding streams to ensure we can maximise that. The most recent one was on the network support grant, which obviously, as I said, although it's not the same amount as last year, is fully funded for the kilometres that are being met. And that would be the expectation and requirement of those that are in receipt of the network support grant, that they look at and implement Fair Work First. And, for example, one aspect is only one aspect of the Fair Work First principles is in terms of the real living wage. And only recently I had a letter from First Bus, letting me know about their commitment on the real living wage, etc. So there's work that's been done as part of the network support grant. It may be something we can probably relay to the committee following this session as to where we are in the review of the conditionality on the other funding, and also the findings we had on what was announced as a review on the we started on the network support grant.
Mm-hmm. Do you think that conditionality needs to go beyond Fair Work to actual quality of delivery of services?
Oh yes, sorry. In point of the quality of delivery of services, that's conditionality is, I suppose, it's the expectation of customers, and I think there's an issue there which I'll take back in relation to discussion with CPT and indeed the bus providers as to, in conditions of grant, do we say that there has to be a warm bus, for example? That kind of, I know that's a challenge in a day like this when in certain parts there may not be the kind of quality of bus. Interesting, I think, again, the variability across the country can't be a lot. I don't know to what extent we can enforce the conditions within the grant that they meet a certain level of service. As you said, it's more the Traffic Commissioner, but with your agreement, I'll maybe take that way to think more about the condition of service as opposed to what my understanding was of conditionality is more to do with the standard of operation in relation to workforce, etc., and Fair Work First.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, there's obviously the basic legal requirements that are enforced by the Commissioner, and I do get a steady stream of complaints about buses that just fail to turn up on a regular basis. So that presumably is something that the Commissioner could enforce. But I think, within the space about how we improve bus services working in partnership, a substantial amount of money going in. I would be interested to hear more about how, the government can extend that conditionality further beyond just basic legal compliance with a timetable.
And I would say that there's different experience in different parts of the country, and we know availability of bus drivers has had in the past a considerable impact on reliability of services. If there are no bus drivers, and there's that causes an issue. It seems to be slightly improving, but again, that depends on, again, conditions, wages and conditions of service for operators and those that want to keep and retain. And I've worked on that, as well as and really important recruitment drives in different parts of the country to try and get more bus people to train as bus drivers.
Mark, I'm sorry, I said the final question. You had three there, so I think you pushed that as far as I can with the timing stage. And I'm afraid, going to have to move on to the next agenda item, which is a debate on the motion S6M 11609, calling on the committee to recommend approval of the draft Bus Services Improvement Partnership Objections Scotland Regulations 2024. I remind everyone that only the Minister may speak in this debate from that end of the committee room. Minister, do you want to speak and move the motion?
Well, I detect from the questions that there's very little concerns about the actual regulations that are in front of us in terms of the objection system. So I would refer to my opening remarks when I set out the rationale for it. It's a technical aspect of making sure that we've got all the system in place, and this is a completion of what's required on the bus service improvement partnerships to ensure that in developing them, if there are plans put in place, that it has a cooperative agreement buy-in from all concerned, and if operators have an objection, there's a mechanism and route that's understood as to how they might do that. But with that, Convener, I'm happy to move.
Okay, so my question to members is, does anyone want to make any contributions at this stage where the Minister will get a chance to sum up and answer them at the end? Does any contributions from members? Sarah?
Just very briefly, I think there's been a lot of questions to the Minister because I think there's a degree of scepticism as to what big changes it's going to deliver, and at the end of the day it's about, will bus users get better services that are more reliable and sustainable? So I think I'm certainly going to let this piece of legislation go through today, but it's the report back and the action afterwards that I'm really interested in. Thank you, Convener.
Okay, Bob?
I suppose just to get a slight balance to the debate, I didn't detect any scepticism. I think what I heard today from the line of question, myself included, was the huge challenges to get that modal shift and individuals and families out of cars and onto buses, but already the significant public investment, massive public investment that sits there, and how that existing money could be used better. And I suppose this subordinate legislation as part of that is about ensuring that local authorities can use new powers that are there, but that bus operators, who remain key and strategic partners, can object as appropriate to some of those measures. And this appears to be a balanced statutory instrument. That's hence why we didn't really ask about that. I think, Convener, we used it more as an opportunity to have a kind of strategic look again at how we take forward publicly funded buses in Scotland in a strategic manner, and a wee bit of wider budget scrutiny. So I didn't detect any cynicism. I should put that on the record, but I did detect significant challenges that we've all got a responsibility to together to address as a Parliament, not just government, and I'll leave it at that. Convener.
Douglas.
Yeah, I wasn't going to speak, but I'm going to speak briefly, Convener, because it was mentioned during the question about the bus lanes in Aberdeen City. And I think sometimes people think I'm actually against those. I'm not. What I was against is the way it was actually done. And I think when we actually introduce things like bus priority measures, it should be done with full consultation with businesses and with residents in that area. And I think what we've seen in Aberdeen was that regulations come forward as experimental traffic orders, which has probably meant, quite a substantial amount of money being spent by the Scottish Government, to be fair, on a scheme that hasn't actually got long-term approval. So potentially that money could be wasted. So I think I just wanted to put that on the record, Convener, because it's often mentioned that I'm not in favour. That's not the case. I just think the way it was done was not the correct way.
And Douglas, having mentioned that, do you want to just make a declaration of interest to remind the committee members of your previous role?
Yeah, thank you, Convener, for reminding me that. And I was like to remind everyone that at the start of the session I was a local councillor at Aberdeen City Council. Thank you.
Which is why, Minister, I was checking with the clerks whether he needed to make a declaration when you pulled me up for talking when you were speaking. But I can do two things at once, Minister, as you will have now noticed. So, Minister, would you like to respond to those comments? I just have one comment to make, and I think I understand your comments about funding, but to make significant change in the way buses are operated and run, it will require significant funding. And on that note, Minister, I'll hand back to you to sum up.
Yeah, I mean, I want to see a strong, sustainable, reliable, affordable, accessible bus system. And to do so, that relies on local authorities and indeed bus operators being able to work in partnership. There are, as I think Mr Doris pointed out, really big challenges coming out of the pandemic. But I think we all need to work collectively to identify how do we do that, because as we all know in our constituencies, bus services are frequently the issues that our constituents do contact us about.
Thank you. So we're now going to move to the question, which is that motion S6M 11609 in the name of Fiona Hislop be approved. Are we all agreed? We are agreed. The committee will report on the outcome of this instrument in due course, and I invite the committee to delegate authority to me as convener to finalise the report for publication. Is the committee happy? Douglas, are you happy?
Yes.
And Jackie? Good. Thank you. Thank you, and thank you, Minister, and your officials for attending. And I'm going to briefly suspend the meeting till 10:25 to allow a changeover of witnesses. Welcome back. Our next item of business is an evidence session on environmental governance in Scotland. In June last year, the Scottish Government published its report into the effectiveness of environmental governance arrangement as required by Section 41 of the UK Withdrawal from the European Union Continuity Scotland Act 2021. The committee has since agreed to carry out a short assessment of the state of environmental governance in Scotland. This morning we're going to hear from a panel of environmental stakeholders and law practitioners to discuss the Scottish Government's report and environmental government issues in Scotland. More broadly. I'm pleased to welcome, first of all, Lloyd Austin, the convener of the governance group, Scottish Environmental Link, Dr Shivali Fifield, the Chief Officer for Environmental Rights Centre for Scotland, Professor Sarah Hendry, Dundee Law School, University of Dundee, Bridget Marshall, the Chief Officer for Scottish Environmental Protection Agency, Professor Simon Parsons, Director of Environmental Planning and Assurance for Scottish Water. And joining us remotely is Jamie Whittle, the convener of the Environmental Law Subcommittee, Law Society for Scotland. Thank you for joining us today. We've got around an hour and a bit for this, and we're going to move to questions from the committee. Now, it is quite a large panel, so for fear of upsetting you all, you might not get to answer every single question, and I'd invite committee members to ensure that they target their questions at the people they want answers from. However, on the first question, I'm going to give you all a chance to answer because it's my question, and what I would do is I would say, please don't over-egg the response, but some concerns have been raised, I think it's fair to say, by stakeholders about how the Scottish Government approached the 2023 Environmental Governance Review, which was a requirement, as we know, of the Continuity Act. Has the Scottish Government provided enough detail in the review? And if not, what's it not provided detail on? So, Lloyd, I'm going to work from you to right and come to Jamie Whittle last. So, Lloyd, if you want to head off. And by the way, if Lloyd gives all the answers to the points you want to raise, you can just say Lloyd is correct. But Lloyd, please.
OK, I can't say that, though, can I? I can't say Lloyd is correct. Well, first of all, convener, thank you for the opportunity to give evidence on this. And the Scottish Environment Link warmly welcomes the fact that the committee are looking at this important topic. I think it's something that deserves more attention and more debate, and I hope what we're able to say today will be useful to you. I think you're right that across stakeholders there was general disappointment with the government's report. Not purely on its outcomes, but the quality of its assessment and its lack of firm proposals was probably the biggest concern to us. Whilst we welcomed the publication of the additional briefing paper during the consultation phase, it didn't provide that much more substance. I think from the various responses to the consultation that are publicly available, have been supplied to you or to have been published by the respondents, because the government hasn't published all the responses yet. I think it's clear that the concerns are widespread and that essentially those concerns relate to the very narrow interpretation of the questions, the depth of the assessment, and the lack of any real analysis of the pros and cons of different measures and so forth. So I think we would very much like to see, in general, I talk about the specific parts of the consultation in subsequent questions when you ask specific things, but in general, I think the most important thing is that the government be encouraged to respond to that concern that was expressed by the respondees, and that some form of fuller, more detailed analysis is carried out or commissioned that can lead to further debate and hopefully actions so that we don't lead to the whole thing effectively being closed down with no kind of response to the issues that have been raised.
Raleigh, do you want to come in on that?
Lloyd is correct. And also, in terms of the detail of what was not provided, I'll just give a quick summary as we put in our submission to you on the 6th of October. The report overall failed to consider whether the establishment of an Environment Court can enhance environmental governance arrangements. And I know we'll talk a little bit more about that in follow-up questions. But in terms of looking at the scope, it did not contain any analysis of the entrenched environmental governance problems which exist today, the lack of enforcement of environmental laws, the lack of access to justice. Scotland is still in breach of our Convention Article 9.4 access to justice requirements. There was no clear indication of how that would be remedied by the deadline of 1st of October 2024. There didn't seem to be any analysis overall of what are the problems of environmental governance and what are the issues that we clearly have around environmental degradation, the climate crisis, the biodiversity crisis, and what's the link between those in Scotland, and what could we do better in terms of environmental governance. The report spent a long time talking about Environmental Standards Scotland. We welcome Environmental Standards Scotland, but they can't resolve everything. And most importantly, they do not address the issues of individual complaints. And we'll talk a little bit more about that, I'm sure, when you ask about how the 250 inquiries that we've received in our free legal advice service, what do those individuals do when they want to access justice? So I think that's the clear headlines for us that I'm sure I'll be able to detail as we progress.
Sarah.
Thank you, Convener. I wouldn't disagree with much of what Lloyd and Shivali have said. I think it was narrow and perhaps disappointingly so. And I would have liked to have seen a bit more on those linkages with other policy areas. There's a lot going on in this space. There's a lot of proposals emerging at the moment. I thought it was quite thin. The biodiversity crisis is mentioned, but there isn't really any sense of how this piece of work is going to link into all those other pieces of work. I think there's a lot to be said, and that came across in the Law Society's paper as well, and ESS, around data and monitoring, and that helps so enormously with looking at enforcement for the benefit of individuals and communities. And I also think there wasn't anything very definite to suggest what would be happening next. It very much had the air of something where, at least at a starting point, the decisions had been made. People were content with where things are at in that narrow scope of the Act, and not much about where we might go in the medium term as a country in terms of environmental governance.
Bridget.
Hello. I agree with the statements made so far about the narrowness of the report. But in many ways, maybe that's not surprising. I think the government took a relatively narrow approach to governance. They were concerned with protecting Scotland's environment post-EU exit. And as others have said, particularly Sarah, they didn't think about what wasn't working particularly well in governance terms in the existing system, which is quite complex. And they also didn't think about taking a step back and taking a broader view of governance. Now, there are a number of things which they referenced in the report that are coming before this Parliament, which includes the Human Rights Bill, but also, I think, the Wellbeing and Sustainable Development Bill. And I think there is an argument which SEPA actually made in our original response to the government's consultation on setting up post-EU exit governance arrangements, that was 2019, that we need a governance system that's able to tackle complex environmental issues that we face today, which are largely systemic, and that is multifaceted and multi-generational. So I think, maybe not surprising, this particular report took a narrow approach. Maybe it is disappointing that the government didn't take the opportunity to build on this narrow approach that's been taken so far, and there is still much to be done in this space.
Simon, what would you like to add?
Yeah, good morning, everybody. So our perspective obviously comes from probably one of Scotland's most regulated organisations across water, soils, the air. So when we've looked at the guidance, I think first of all, obviously welcome the 5 principles that have been put forward in the guidance. The key for us will be getting the detail behind those, and that's what's lacking at the moment, is a real practical application of that guidance, because that will be key for us in terms of how we make decisions, how we make investment decisions, how we prioritise our activities across Scotland. So more than anything else, it's really welcome the principles. The key is the practical applications of how they will be used and implemented.
Okay, and finally, Jamie, are you going to break ranks and say it's brilliant?
Thank you. Good morning, convener. And thank you very much for the opportunity to speak. I'm afraid I'm not necessarily going to break rank. What I would say is that the Law Society of Scotland's response in many ways echoes comments made before, but in particular, there are maybe 3 points I'd like to pick up. One is the need to have detail on ongoing issues that were in place at the time of Brexit, and we would welcome a greater consideration of those, such as the nature of appeals, the costs of remedying environmental justice, the importance of ensuring enforcement, consultation, public participation, these sorts of issues which have been existing and have required attention. The second point I would wish to make is really about the general question of what we mean by effectiveness, because as the Law Society of Scotland has submitted, it's very difficult to be able to measure the progress that is being made and judge whether or not one has been effective unless there are some key indicators and strategies. And has been alluded already in relation to biodiversity, the report does mention about the environment strategy which the Scottish Government is taking forward and progressing at the moment. But thinking about, for example, the link into that and measuring what outcomes ideally should be reached. And then the final point where we considered that matters were light in analysis was in terms of initial administrative stages of regulatory decision-making, so whether or not that's in the planning or in other administrations, and really just the importance of trying to get things right at an early stage before one is drawn into an appeal stage. Thank you.
Okay, that's not quite, well, I guess from the evidence that's probably what I should expect, but it wasn't a wholehearted ringing endorsement of the process so far. So there are questions from committee members, and I'm going to come to Sarah Boyatt first. Sarah.
Thanks very much, convener. Yeah, it's come across in terms of the written evidence, which we're very grateful for, and the oral evidence so far, that there's some really big ticket issues that need to be addressed. So I maybe want to kick off and ask what difference has actually been made in terms of engagement with Environmental Standards Scotland. It's now sitting there, but I think one of the comments that struck out for me was the comments, I think, by Scottish Environment Link, welcoming the acceptance that Scotland is in breach of the access to justice requirements of Aarhus in relation to costs. So there's something about how do you get that difference to be made? And I don't know if maybe start off with you, Lloyd, but I'd be keen to get a sense of the panel. There seems to be a big gap between what Environmental Standards Scotland was meant to achieve and actually the narrowness of what's been expected thus far. So do you want to give a quick comment, Lloyd, and then maybe pick up one or two of the other evidence submissions that we've had today?
Yeah, I mean, I think in terms of Environmental Standards Scotland, I think it's early days still, but I think the most important thing to say is what we very much welcomed its creation under the Continuity Act. Some form of environmental kind of oversight body to replace the Commission was important post-Brexit, and we have the Office of Environment Protection, of course, for England and Wales, England and Northern Ireland and reserved areas. So it's important that it's there, but it was never going to solve all of the post-Brexit governance gaps. I think one thing I would refer you to would be the the report from the round table that the previous Cabinet Secretary commissioned in the last Parliament that was chaired by Professor Campbell-Gemmell that looked at the range of governance issues that needed fixed as a result of Brexit, and an oversight body in the form of what became Environmental Standards Scotland was one of the recommendations, and it was very positive that that was picked up and taken forward. But there was a range of other things to do with data and monitoring, for instance, that has been slipped and has not been picked up. Environmental Standards Scotland was never going to address access to justice issues. The failure to comply with Aarhus Article 9 is actually a matter for the government and the court service. It's not a matter for Environmental Standards Scotland. Of course, Environmental Standards Scotland can offer its opinion, but it's somebody else that has to fix it. And this consultation does, from a positive point of view, acknowledge the failure to comply with that Aarhus Convention article. But the items that are set out, there are 5 bullets in the report. They're all things that could help, but they're not things that will help, because we don't know the outcome of those processes that have been put in place. And so essentially we need some drive from government to pick up those 5 processes and make sure they deliver the right outcome, which is to ensure we move towards compliance in relation to the prohibitive expense of taking action in environmental law issues. So I hope that answers our access to justice point.
Yeah, that's really helpful, and it kind of links into to what extent Environmental Standards Scotland has actually functioned as people expected. So I can see some nodding both from Dr. Shivali and from Professor Sarah. So do you two want to, one of you want to kick off there?
Yeah, I'm happy to I mean, I'm not hugely involved with Environmental Standards Scotland. I think I also welcome its establishment, there's no question. I think one of the problems is that different people hoped for and expected different things. So some people would have hoped it to have had a wider remit and to be more fully resourced and to be able to do more and more quickly. And others feel that it's progressing nicely, or perhaps even that it has quite extensive powers that they're a little concerned about. So I think that spread of views is quite reasonable. But also it could never have solved everything. And one of the problems with the consultation was that it kind of excluded any other wider discussion. It talked about, well, we set up Environmental Standards Scotland and they're doing a good job, and that seemed to be enough. But they would never have been enough. They're only ever a part of the post-Brexit arrangements, but the wider governance arrangements as well.
Okay, and...
Yes, I think so. We launched our free advice service the same year the Environmental Standards Scotland was launched. And of the 250 inquiries that were received, we've submitted 11 representations to Environmental Standards Scotland. I'm going to call them ESS for short, just to keep it. And so that's almost a third of their overall representations. So I think we've got quite good evidence base. Again, want to stress how much we welcome them. But their role is to address systemic failures in environmental governance. Their role is not to, at the moment, to address individual complaints. We have had some concerns around the timeliness of how they respond to representations and how it's used its enforcement powers to date. And we've detailed that in our comprehensive consultation response, so I won't repeat all of that. But one of the key things that the report did acknowledge was the inability for ESS within its powers to address individual problems. So how do we identify systemic environmental governance problem? I mean, individuals and communities can't do that. So we've had to spend a lot of time, a lot of resource to identify the individual issue. Water pollution in River Almond, for example. Is that a systemic issue? Well, we took about 6 months to talk to communities, to make the gaps, to make the connections between other issues and say, no, actually, we can raise this as a systemic issue. We then take We then do that, and then it takes time for ESS to respond back. And then there's correspondence with SEPA as well. There's correspondence with Freedom of Information responses, appeals to that. We go on, and 12 months later, we're then informed that there's no case to find. Meanwhile, communities across River Almond are wondering what to do and where do they go. So I hope that's a really good example of how, regardless of how wonderful all the systems might work in theory, in practice, individual communities who've been campaigning around water pollution or environmental degradation for a good couple of years, sewage sludge spreading, for example, on agricultural land, and still, even with our intervention, with our correspondence with SEPA, with submissions of FOIs, with Environmental Standards Scotland, they're left with no remedy.
I think SEPA had quite a lot of inquiries as well. It might be worth.
Yeah, I was going to move. It's beautifully done, actually. The example given, but SEPA and Scottish Water on that issue of what differences actually happened, and to pick up the point that Bridget made earlier about wellbeing and sustainable development. There's both Scottish Government work considering policy and legislation in my own member's bill. So it's that issue about what difference is ESS making in terms of relationship with, first of all, maybe SEPA and then Scottish Water?
So if you look at the investigations and analysis that ESS have done, SEPA and Nature Scot, they're probably two of the bodies that have been subject to the most scrutiny, and we welcome that scrutiny. But I think it is worth saying for balance that there is now greater opportunity provided by the setting up of ESS for scrutiny of the implementation of environmental law. So previously, under the EU system, there were extremely few cases brought and investigated by the Commission that directly affected Scotland or regulators like SEPA. The Commission had oversight of 28 countries, many of whom had much less developed environmental protection systems as we had, and so the focus on the UK, and particularly Scotland, was very limited. So in those few cases that we were scrutinised by the Commission in the past, that scrutiny was at the Member States level. And the new governance arrangements, I think, have successfully brought opportunities for scrutiny much closer to home. And if you look at the number of investigations that ESS have undertaken in the short while that they've been in being, the number of investigations is far higher than we would have been subject to from the Commission as a member state. The range of issues is much broader. The range of issues go from genuinely systemic ones like air quality to much more local issues. And the direct contact with regulators like SEPA is much closer. So I think it's worth saying for the record that these new arrangements will take time to bed in. They're operating in a very different way from how the EU used to operate. And all of us are players in this system, are still learning about it, as are ESS. But I do think there's something about making the whole system work as we have it at the moment, because we all have the same outcomes, which is want to improve the environment, Scotland's environment, and improve things for communities. So I think we all need to work collaboratively together with this system that we currently have to make sure that it works effectively. On the point about individual regulatory decisions, SEPA operates within a system set up by legislation that has appeals processes, that has other scrutiny on those individual decisions. And we are quite clear, and I think the government and ESS have been quite clear, that ESS have not been set up to be an additional appeal forum against those individual regulatory decisions. But as Savali has said, that those individual decisions, if SEPA is, continually misdirecting itself under the legal basis under which it operates, then you will see a systemic pattern, and that systemic pattern can then be investigated by ESS. So I think that's the points I want to make. But that is all about the limited system, Sarah, that has been set up. But I do think it's something that we should, as a country, think about evolving as these new bits of legislation come into place. And we need to continually ask ourselves the question of what do we need, not only to protect from the exit from the EU, but for wider environmental governance, which I think is something the whole panel has really commented on.
Thanks. And then from Scottish Water, did you have a particular perspective on this?
So obviously, just as Lloyd and others have described, actually, our interactions with ESS are all very new organisation, and obviously building a new good team in the actual organisation itself. Its role is really important. It's replacing the missing bit of governance oversight that was provided previously by the EU, but that was provided on member states. And the big difference of ESS is it's now down to public organisations rather than member states. And I think that's the part that we have still yet to truly understand. What does an action from ESS or a recommendation from ESS actually mean for us going forward? It was always very clear if the EU, and as Bridget's very well described, is the EU would have put an action on the member state, and then the member state would have decided how we would meet or not that recommendation. And that meant, for example, when we were having discussions for us as Scottish Water about priorities for investment, priorities for our ministerial objectives, for example, it was always clear how that would flow through. It's less clear at the moment in terms of how actions, for example, from ESS will flow through to us as an organisation, because we're regulated by SEPA, we're not regulated by ESS in that sense. So I think there's still a bit to get that clarity about what it is. And I think the key one, I think Shivali's mentioned it, is their focus has to be on systemic issues, not individual issues. That's the role of SEPA. I don't think they're here to provide the role of an ombudsman, for example. I think that role is already fulfilled in the whole environment.
Okay, thanks very much.
I'm feeling that you've left Jamie Whittle out, having gone through the entire panel. And it's just quite difficult as convener, if I can just say this, Jamie, to you, to see if you want to ask a question, because it goes through broadcasting. So if you wave at me, I'll assume that that's you wanting to come in. And I don't know if you're waving at me now, but I'll give you the opportunity to come in at this stage.
Thank you, convener. No, I'm not waving, but I'll pass. But thank you for the opportunity. Okay,
perfect. So the next question, the questions go to Mark Ruskell. Mark.
Yeah, thanks, convener. I was going to ask a series of questions about individual cases, but I think that evidence we've just heard is very useful in that regard. I suppose there are just two follow-ups then on the back of that. One is about whether you think there are pieces of work that ESS have done recently which do kind of batch together concerns that have come from individual cases, and to then go ahead and make recommendations about changing systemic approaches to regulation. So an example of that might be acoustic deterrent devices, for example. Shivali mentioned the River Armand, where in your view it perhaps hasn't worked so well, but I'm wondering if there are areas where it has worked quite well in terms of collating those individual cases and pointing to a systemic change. And the other point really for SEPA to answer was quite struck by your submission, where you talk about an increase in the number of complaints, perhaps with, in your view, an expectation from complainers that ESS will then, pick up on a batch of complaints, a volume of complaints that are coming through to SEPA, and again do that work to address a systemic issue. I wonder if you could sort of elaborate a little bit more on that. And I suppose I'm a little bit startled if SEPA is saying, well, we're a bit concerned about a number of complaints and how we're going to resource this, and that's a problem with the system rather than perhaps addressing the practice of SEPA. But I'd be interested in comments on both those issues.
Okay, well, can I start with the second question, if that's okay? So I think it's an unintended consequence of of the new system. And as I've said before, we are all learning in this new system. So I think there has been an idea that because you have to exhaust all existing domestic complaint remedies before you can go to ESS, that in a way people have to go through our complaints procedure before they can then move on to ESS. And we have had a number of complaints which have come from the Environmental Rights Centre, but that actually say that in the letters that come to us. So it's not that I think we object to that, we just think it's an unintended consequence that is worth just airing. We obviously deal with all complaints in the same way, and we have actually begun to liaise in a much more regular way with the Environmental Rights Centre, so that in a sense we have some sort of informal discussion with them before these complaints come in. So I think this is all signs of the system beginning to mature a bit and us all finding our feet. And as I previously said, I think it's really important that all the players within this new system learn to work together as collaboratively as possible, because we are in a public sector funding uncertainties, and it's really important that all our resources are used as effectively as possible. So that is really at the heart of our comments, Mark, as an unintended consequence. I think people hadn't thought through of the new system, and maybe it will bed down as we become more used to all operating within this system. And obviously we always prioritise both complaints but also scrutiny from ESS in terms of our resourcing. So it's really important that we do that, and we take obligations with those that regulate us really seriously. So we do prioritise work with ESS, and that means that other work that we're doing may be slowed down to accommodate that work with ESS.
Okay, I appreciate that, and appreciate the comments about the process there. Are there any other reflections then on individual complaints and how they've been effectively addressed by ESS to drive a systemic change beyond the example of the River Amond?
Just to clarify, Mark, Chevalier and Lloyd, I think, would like to come in on those, if you're happy to take them to start with, and then see where it goes. Chevalier, if you'd like to.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you. Yes, just a quick come back also on SEPA's observation of the increase in complaints. We hope it's a good thing. You know, Environmental Rights Centre for Scotland was set up to try and amplify the voice of individuals and communities. We don't want to make complaints. We want to ask for a freedom of information request and it to be, the information to be supplied straight away. It's not. That's why we have to do an appeal. Once we do the appeal, or we threaten appeal, then we may get the information. We're really sympathetic to the limited resources of Scottish Water, SEPA and ESS. But they do have a duty to ensure high environmental standards are enforced. And I think we have to keep on remembering that we have communities at the other end who are wanting to see an improvement in their environmental quality. We wouldn't have to ask for an FOI if the public registers were maintained. We appreciate the difficulty the SEPA have had. Nevertheless, if we had those public registers, we wouldn't have to ask for them. Surely the key message here is not how many complaints SEPA is receiving, but what are we doing to tackle the root of those complaints? Individuals do not come to us easily. They want to have answers to why they have the issues they have in their environment. So that's the first thing around the unintended consequences. I think we're probably part of the unintended consequence, but I think we're quite proud of that. In terms of whether ESS has done well in packaging the systemic issues, Mark, I think this is one of the things that we are hoping will happen as ESS develops and consolidates. That isn't what they've been doing. It's been left to us and communities to identify whether it's a systemic problem. I would love ESS to start monitoring the kind of nature of issues that we're having and present to us what the trends are. ERCS is beginning to do that through the 250 inquiries. We're not there yet. We're a really tiny organisation, but we're doing our best. When we have identified issues such as breaches of the Climate Change Act on the lack of the publication of a climate impact assessment on the infrastructure investment plan, we've submitted that to Environmental Standards Scotland. We've also submitted to Environmental Standards Scotland the breach of access to Justice 9-4, but it's actually been our independent activities, such as pre-litigation correspondence with the Scottish Government, that's actually got a more timely response to how we're going to get that published climate impact assessment. So I hope that will get better. And as I said, we've got very good relationships with Environmental Standards Scotland, but it's still work in progress.
Yeah, I agree with things that Shivali said about individual issues there. I wanted to just look at the individual cases point from a sort of policy perspective. Scottish Environment Link, when the Continuity Act was still a bill, was going through, we kind of were quite vocal in wanting the exclusion of individual cases in the Act removed, so that, and that was on the basis that the Commission didn't have an exclusion in its remit, and actually quite a lot of the significant cases over the years that the Commission took forward, whether that be in the UK or elsewhere in the EU, were started off as individual cases, and they led to case law that then meant that all 28 member states, including the UK and Scotland, had to comply with that case law. However, that wasn't removed, and it's in the Act. I do, to some extent, agree with the government's concern about the seeking to prevent an additional layer of appeal in the process. But I have to say that from the community or individual's point of view, there isn't a layer of appeal already because of the other issues that we've talked about, the access to justice and the other challenges that communities and individuals face when they want to be challenging of a public body. So there is pros and cons to that effect, and I think that the difficulty is that when is an individual case a concern raised by a community about an individual case? When is it an individual case alone, and when is it a symptom of a systemic issue? And is it for the community or the complainant to identify it as a symptom of a systemic issue, or is it for the public body concerned? And therefore, I think there needs to be some kind of, if that exclusion is going to remain in the Act, there needs to be some kind of interpretation and clarity that indicates that communities and others can bring forward examples of individual cases, but it's for ESS to group them in together and to analyse whether those individual cases from communities are symptoms of a systemic issue or not, or whether it's just some sort of one-off exception. And finally, going back to where I started, if ESS is not to provide an additional layer of appeal, then there has to be a system of an effective form of governance that enables communities and individuals to be able to be more challenging about individual decisions in other mechanisms, either through the individual regulators themselves or through the courts or through the Scottish Government, etc.
Mark.
All done.
All done. Oh gosh.
Unless there are others who wish to offer some insights into that.
No. That's not me saying no, Mark. They're shaking their heads. So they could have done if they wanted to. Ben, as Deputy Convener, I should give you the opportunity to ask your questions now.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning to the panel. Thanks for your time this morning and your submissions. Before I ask my questions, I just want to draw members' attention to my register of interests as a solicitor on the roll of solicitors and a previous practising and non-practising member of the Law Society of Scotland. All of this is about the climate crisis and biodiversity crisis at the larger scale. But in terms of the constituencies that we represent and the communities that we serve, it's about quality of place, quality of local environment and quality of life within that. And what interests me about this wider issue is how do we make improvements together And I take SEPA's point around wanting to work collaboratively, and I've certainly seen that in my constituency at the Seafield Wastewater Treatment Works, for example, that Mr Parsons has been engaged in, and SEPA have as well. And we've seen improvement without the need for legal process through collaboration. But I do think there are questions about access to justice in order to make that improvement. So I'm open-minded of the idea of an environmental court, and I know that, Dr Fulfield, you've been involved in the considerations about the Water of Leith Basin in my constituency. So thank you for that. So what are the views on the panel on the need for an environmental court in Scotland? Do we really need it? And to what extent do you agree with concerns raised in the written evidence by ERCS that the Scottish Government's consideration of this issue in the review did not meet the requirements of the Continuity Act, taking into account that the Government went on to publish a further briefing on this issue and extended the consultation period? Dr Fulfield, you seem to want to answer this question first. So.
Well, I'm not sure if I should answer the question first, because of course I am the Chief Officer for the Environmental Rights Centre for Scotland, who raised the issue of the government being in breach of the statutory duty to properly consider whether or not an environmental court can enhance governance arrangements. And as you know, we sought senior counsel advice on that. And the only reason we haven't moved to litigation is the irony of it, because of the prohibitive expense of taking access to justice. So perhaps I'll hand over to somebody else to talk a little bit more about that.
First, then, from a legal point of view. I think, Jamie, I think everything's done for you, as far as I remember from when I was remote. They activate your microphone. They're usually quite good at making sure it's not when you're making a comment you don't want to be heard, but I think they've done it for you, Jamie.
No, thank you. I'm obliged, Convener. In terms of the Law Society's position it's set out in responses thus far on the environmental court idea, it's certainly commented in the past, and then more recently in its recent consultation response, probably the headline point is that whilst it very much acknowledges that a further briefing was provided by the Scottish Government on this idea, the Law Society would have welcomed greater consideration into the benefits of having an environmental court, because the Law Society considers that a well-designed environment court could provide significant improvements to access to justice. Aside from that main point, other aspects the Law Society has suggested might merit consideration is the idea of specific court procedure for environmental matters. We have, by analogy, in the Court of Session, a commercial court and procedure for commercial matters. But when one is dealing with aspects to do with the environment, and there are particular technical aspects that require to be dealt with, it may well merit consideration of having a system that incorporates that more fully. And maybe just a final point is that if taking such a notion forward, one of the very important things to embed in the system is ensuring that there's sufficient technical expertise within the judiciary, the legal system, to be able to deal with matters that may come before the courts. Thank you.
I think that point around expertise is really significant, and also for communities and those bringing any challenge to know which direction to turn to. I don't know if you have anything more you want to say about that in just terms of it seems quite a clunky and cluttered landscape at the moment. Is the Civil Litigations Expenses and Group Proceedings Scotland Act 2018 relevant here? Is that making a difference in the here and now? Don't know if you want to add any more on that.
A couple of things, not only about the lack of expertise, but as you've already identified, and we've written extensively on this in 2 different reports, but I think the complexity at the moment on where you take environmental cases is so complicated. having one place to bring all of those environmental cases together would also increase expertise of the judiciary. In a tribunal system, and there's hundreds of examples across the globe, and we've cited many of those in our reports, you found that it's been more accessible. It's been cheaper because you've got all the experts together and we've got one place to go. It could have an outreach kind of model rather than just one place in the court of session to go to. And then the other thing as well is about how we can begin to think about merits. So as you know, in the judicial review at the moment, we can't think about the merit of a case. We can also consider other areas of reform. So time and time again, when we've thought about how do we make access to justice more accessible and more affordable, we keep on coming back to a Scottish Environment Court model. And it's not good enough, I don't think, to read in the report, well, we don't have many cases, therefore there isn't a problem. We don't have many cases because it's impossible to get to access to justice.
And sorry, Deputy Minister, Sarah's very keen to come in, I think,
right,
on that,
yeah.
point. Sorry.
Professor Henry.
And Lloyd is as well. Sorry, I've opened the floodgate, but Sarah was sitting patiently.
No, not pushing to come in, but happy to say a little bit, because I think that an environmental court, the discussion around this has been going on for a long time, and not just here. And I actually think it was a missed opportunity in the report, I think. The government could have said more about it and in more positive terms. They could have produced the additional briefing paper earlier or incorporated some of that. They could have suggested taking this forward with some further consultation around what a court would look like, because it's very complex. I mean, the regulatory field is so complex. Is it just civil? Is it criminal as well? Is it just appeals? Is it first instance and appeals? So, all of that could have been an opportunity to take this area of consultation forward, linking it into some of those big strategic issues around biodiversity, but also thinking about your quality of life issues, what we used to call environmental incivilities. They make such a difference to people's lives and really do bring things close to home. So I think it was a missed opportunity not to be more positive about some form of specialist court. To be honest, I think it would have helped the government enormously if they had done that. So yeah, that would be my thinking on it.
Lloyd is.
Please, Lloyd.
Yeah, well, first I would agree with Sarah in terms of the missed opportunities. In terms of whether or not the consultation met the legal requirements of the Continuity Act, I don't know the answer to that, although I note Chevali's reference to the Council's opinion on that. And I also note the irony of the fact that question couldn't be addressed because of the problems of access to justice. So it does kind of almost become a vicious circle in terms of that. But in terms of the big picture of environmental court, Sarah also mentioned that the debate's gone on for a long time. And there's an awful lot of material out there. And when the debate started in Scotland back in the early 2000s, Scotland would have been ahead of the field in setting up an environmental court, but in the last 15, 20 years, there are now over 1,000 environmental courts or tribunals in jurisdictions around the world, and if we went forward, we'd be catching up with the rest of the world rather than... and therefore, I think it is a huge missed opportunity. I think the report is quite weak in terms of the analysis of examining the evidence for and against and the assertions that are made against actions, as Chevali used the example of there not being very many cases. Well, we know why that is. That's the vicious circle again. I just wanted to draw your attention to something that was in Scottish Environment Link's response. Because we've strongly favoured this concept of an environmental court or tribunal for many years, and we supported it in the last consultation, 2016-17. And the analysis of those responses said that a substantial majority of the respondents favoured the introduction of an environmental court or tribunal. The majority envisaged a specialist court or tribunal as a means to reducing costs and improving access to justice. And I think, you know, the government's decision not to proceed at that time may well have been right in the circumstances of the time, because as the government said, that at that point there was enormous uncertainty about the landscape caused by Brexit, and they decided not to proceed at present. They didn't say that they were opposed to it in principle. And therefore, this consultation, a few years later, when the Brexit issue has kind of settled down a bit, and they've got time to move on, this could have been an opportunity to really do a proper analysis of the pros and cons, a proper analysis of the options of how to proceed, whether or not such a court is a new entity or whether it's an evolution of one of the existing entities, whether it's done under the tribunal system, etc., and look at the pros and cons of all those. And therefore, it's a huge missed opportunity. And finally, I just want to underline the merits point, because one of the big issues that individuals and communities have is that they disagree with regulators or public bodies about often the merits of a case or an issue. And yet, if they challenge it, both parties end up kind of dealing with those merits by proxy, because the judicial review system means they have to attack each other on procedure rather than having a proper look at the merits. And the idea of having an expert environmental court or tribunal where the court officers are experts in the environment to resolve those disputes on the merits would actually be, you know, hugely advantage, I think, to both parties, the public body party and the community party.
This would be about building a mechanism for justice for the medium to long term, not just in the years ahead. I mean, Jamie Whittle, I mean, can you give an indication? You talked about the commercial specialist court earlier. How many years has that been in place to this juncture, approximately? Decades?
Sorry. Thank you. Yes, certainly ever since I was a trainee, which was in around 2000, so it was in existence before then. So yes, 20, I would expect certainly over 25 years. And of course, in terms of just that point that that Lloyd made about the ability to go into the merits of a case, there are very strict rules in the Court of Session, for example, where there's this concept of planning judgment that the courts can't go behind what may have been decided by a decision-making body. And so there are limitations in terms of being able to look at the quality of an environmental decision, and sometimes things will skirt through without being able to have been challenged effectively. And in that context, to me, a real importance is to take a step back and ask the question about what's the underlying purpose that one's trying to achieve. And if tackling the nature crisis and the climate crisis are your drivers, coupled with an access to justice element that can benefit constituents, then I would suggest it's important to look at that question in that wider context.
Okay, thank you. Does anyone else want to contribute on these points? Okay. Do you want to bring us up?
Yeah, well, there were some supplementaries that were indicated might be required here. Sarah, you said you might want to ask a question on this, and I know Mark Ruskell has definitely got one. Sarah, do you want to start? I'm trying not to say kick off because we don't want that in the committee, but do you want to start with a question and then we'll go to Mark?
Yeah, well, I was thinking about how it follows on to the upcoming human rights legislation, which potentially is a new human right to a healthy environment, and thinking about how you would deliver that in practice, and having both an enforcement framework and different legal and non-judicial opportunities to get redress. So just seeing how that relates, following on from Ben's questions about an environmental court to linking into Aarhus compliance. I'm seeing a couple of nods there. I don't know which of you wants to kick off. Sarah?
Yeah, I mean, I also responded to the Human Rights Bill consultation, as I think others have as well. For the record, I am in support of a human right to a clean environment and indeed a human right to water and indeed incorporation of ESCR rights into domestic law. So that is my position. But I do think, well, there are huge issues around resourcing that bill and around the time that it will take. And I also think, as an environmental lawyer, that it's a little bit sad that that's what we need to realise the right to a clean environment and a decent quality of life for people in communities. I just feel that in a country like Scotland, with lots of resources of different kinds and a well-established system of environmental law, that it would be really nice if the natural environment and people's interactions with it were regulated and monitored in a way that didn't require an extra step of giving people a human right to enforce through some other set of mechanisms in order to achieve that. So that's my thinking around that just now.
Yeah, so that point about getting it right in the first place, you don't need the redress. Did you want to come in on that one as well?
Yeah, so as part of Environmental Rights Centre, we are the only environmental NGO on the advisory board to the Human Rights Bill, and so that's been a real privilege and great opportunity. So we've fought hard to advocate for the right to a healthy environment to be part of the bill's framework, and particularly the substantive right and those 6 features. But completely agree with Sarah that we shouldn't be in the case of having to put that into a human rights framework as well. I think in terms of how the two fit together is really important and a really important point. So we've again raised in 2 places the current breach of access to justice in the Aarhus Convention and how will the Human Rights Bill address that. And I think currently in the consultation document, and we've responded to this in detail, as with the Environmental Governance Report, although both acknowledge the current breach, there's no clear undertaking of how that breach is going to be remedied by the 1st of October 2024 deadline. There are issues that are raised that the Human Rights Bill will address reform of legal aid. They will address issues of standing and the reasonable test in terms of judicial review. But again, we don't know how much that's going to be just on the Human Rights Bill, how much that will go into other areas of environmental governance. There's also a number of different oversight bodies which are raised in the Human Rights Bill and thinking about different powers. We assume, and we've advocated for Environmental Standards Scotland to be that oversight body, whether you call it the regulator that regulates the regulators or the ombudsman function, that needs to be properly considered in terms of how you consolidate and develop environmental standards in the future. But fundamentally, what we're talking about in terms of the Environmental Court is an independent judicial route to remedy. And that is different to anything else that we've been talking about to date in terms of access to justice on the environment. And I think your point, Deputy Convener, is really well made, that how do we improve the judicial route to remedy so that when all else fails, there's a credible threat of legal action, because that in itself will improve regulation and enforcement. And one of the things that we've noted, and we said it in our response to the Environmental Governance Report, as I already mentioned, we have some concerns about how Environmental Standards Scotland seems to be risk-averse in carrying out its enforcement powers, because it has more enforcement powers at the moment than, for example, the Scottish Human Rights Commission. And the Human Rights Bill, they're wanting to increase the powers of the Commission. So you have a body here that has these powers, but they seem reluctant to use them. And Jim Martin, the chair of Environmental Standards Scotland, said in one of his speeches that one of the reasons for that is because of the prohibitive cost of going to judicial review. So we do believe that if we had an Environment Court or Tribunal, that would be one way of reducing costs, an opportunity for environmental standards to reduce their costs in the public purse and actually follow through on enforcement action. Because they do have, at the moment, the right to judicial review. But as I said, are probably quite concerned about the cost to go to that extra mile if we needed to.
It's really useful. Anyone else want to come in on the back of that? Yeah, Lloyd.
Very briefly, Scottish Environment Link strongly supports the concept of human right to a healthy environment and its inclusion in the proposed Human Rights Bill. I think our concern is that unless the governance questions are fixed, the access to justice, the environmental court, etc., the powers of Environmental Standards Scotland, there is a risk that we'll have human right to a healthy environment that is a human right on paper and not an effective and enforceable one. So, you know, I think the linkage between the two, the governance debate and the Human Rights Bill one, is important, and it's important that in order to make the Human Rights Bill effective, the governance questions need to be answered. I'd just like to return briefly to Sarah Boyack's point about getting it right up front rather than sorting things out by redress. And I completely agree that that's the most desirable thing to do. But I think that, having spoken about a vicious circle just now, I'd like to point out that you can have a virtual circle as well. And actually, if there is a right to redress, in other words, that if communities and individuals have a right to hold public bodies to account where they may have failed, that provides an incentive to the public body to get it right first. So actually, the incentive to getting it right up front is for that right to redress to be there. But in the absence of that right to redress, that incentive to get it right first isn't there, and therefore there is a risk of errors being made and so on.
Okay, just before we move on to March, Vali, you made some comments about ESS there, and I'm not going to defend them. I'm just going to ask a question of you. They're a relatively new organisation. They're bedding in. They're finding their feet, and trying to establish a pattern of work. And we've had evidence from them in the committee, and we see a trend, I think would be the right way to say it. So you were a little bit condemning. Do you think it's a little bit unfair to judge them at the moment as they find their feet and move forward?
Yes, and I apologise if I was condemning. Not at all. I think I want to stress how much we welcome ESS and how good working relationship we have, and that as we submitted 11 representations to ESS, I suppose it's that balance, isn't it, between wanting ESS to be as strong and as powerful as they can be, and I suppose again that's the advocacy around an environmental court, and everybody wanting to test their powers and just wanting the best for our clients as well. So no, I suppose thank you. And no overt criticism.
It's just an observation that if you want them to run as fast as possible, they're going to have to learn the process of not tripping over their own feet as they do it, if you'll excuse the analogy. But I'm just worried that they're new and we need to give them time. But Mark, you have some questions before I move to, I think I've got a further question, and then Bob. So, Mark.
Yeah, I was just going back to Deputy Convener's questions around, the environmental court, the case for that, and also, our lack of compliance with Aarhus. I'm thinking about how do you see this debate moving forward? Because I think, Lloyd, you already mentioned that in the last session of Parliament, there was the round table on environmental governance that was chaired by Campbell Gamble. It feels like we've been going around this issue for some time. So if you see a way forward on that, what does that actually look like? Because I think there have been calls and evidence for a further governance review. And I suppose I'm interested in, how would that be different to what we've already seen coming through and what government has already conducted itself?
Lloyd.
I think that was partly directed at me. So yes, I would agree. It's been ongoing. I think the key thing is that actually the risk is that with the report as it is, there is a risk that there will be no next steps. And I think the most important thing for stakeholders, and I hope the committee, to try and achieve is that there is some form of next step. So to move to Mark's question, what is that next step? I think the next step has got to be some kind of commitment to do a proper analysis and look at the options and to, in relation to an environmental court, and to that will need some kind of, we've suggested in Lincoln, an expert working group of some type, rather akin to the way that Alan Verity's group worked in terms of the grouse moor management question. Now, I completely accept that that actually sort of looks as though it's, you know, going round another review, another process, etc., etc. But the risk is that if you don't do anything like that, then you actually do nothing, which would be the worst case scenario. So I think you have to do something of that type in relation to an environmental court. In relation to access to justice, I think the ball is in the government's court. I think the 5 processes that are outlined, they could be clearer and firmer about how those processes are going to deliver access to justice and costs questions. And in terms of the wider governance review and the report from the last Parliament that I mentioned, I think, again, the committee could put that back to the government and say, you've taken forward environmental principles, you've taken forward ESS in the Continuity Act. That's very good. Progress made, tick. But what about these other things that Professor Gemmel's group raised? And again, I think that's you know, something that the committee could discuss with the Minister, but those are things that probably are in the government's court to decide whether or not they want to pick them up or not.
Sorry, I've slipped past the Deputy Convener who's got another question, so back to you, Ben.
Thanks, Convener. It's related to what you've just said, Mr Rustin. So, panel members have made strong arguments why, in your view, there should be an environmental court. But regarding the compliance with our House Convention, in terms of the Scottish Government's review, it does accept that there is a need to consider improvements to access to justice in principle, and sets out a number of proposals, in particular proposals to tackle the prohibitive costs of legal action. Mr Austin, you've given some views just in your last answer on them, but I just wondered if you or other panellists have any further views on the proposed reforms from the government in their response.
Yes, in the government's paper, they put forward. I'm trying to find it.
You rather than in their response.
In their review, yes, absolutely. They refer to. Here it goes. Yes, they refer to 5 current work that's ongoing to aid access to justice, and they include the reference to the Human Rights Bill process. But as Sarah indicated earlier, the consultation on the Human Rights Bill doesn't actually indicate how it's going to get fixed. So there's a sort of unanswered question there. There are opportunities there, but how it's going to come up. They talk about the review of protected expenses orders being carried out by the Scottish Civil Justice Council. Our question there is we don't know what the Council's doing, what the Council's going to propose. We don't know if it will address the situation, and when we've asked for the Council to consult with stakeholders, they're not doing any form of public consultation. They refer to an exemption from court fees for Aarhus cases in the Court of Session. Well, that is very welcome and that's positive, but that has a number of limitations. First of all, it doesn't address any courts or tribunals other than the Court of Session. And secondly, actually court fees are not the most significant part of any costs associated with court cases. It's a small but welcome measure. They talk about legal aid reform, which is again another positive idea, but it doesn't actually give any pledge to deliver any reform or any resources and so on. And then they talk about exploring means to provide further expert support to prosecutors and the judiciary. Well, that actually is the expertise question. And that is, I think, best answered by an environmental court, because that leads to concentration of expertise in the same place. So I think that all of the 5 processes that they refer to are all welcome and all positive and might lead to solving the problem, but there's no clear demonstration that they will, if you see what I mean. So I think government has to grip the activities and demonstrate how they will address those costs issues rather than how they might.
I think Jamie Whittle wants to come in, so if we went to Jamie Whittle first and then Shivali, if that's all right with you.
Thank you, Convener. Just picking up that point about costs, if I may, and really Lloyd noted a number of those. I would particularly wish to highlight the importance from a Law Society of Scotland perspective of the need for making sure that there is access to legal aid in civil environmental matters. I would comment that it's a particularly difficult area for people to be able to obtain legal aid support to run an environmental case. I note that the consultation there is looking at potentially extending into non-government organisations, but just for individuals alone, it can be a real challenge. And so what that leaves people with is just thinking about the costs of environmental litigation. And as a solicitor, it's one of the inevitable costs one is asked at the front end of potentially representing somebody. And it's a very, very difficult exercise to be able to carry out, in part because one can never be certain about how long a case is going to run. Will it be appealed? Will it be appealed further? Protective expenses orders are, in my submission, an extremely welcome tool that the Court of Session have implemented into their practice. As was noted a moment ago, that is really just focused on the Court of Session for the time being. But that doesn't cover a party's own costs, for which, if they can't get legal aid, if they're not well resourced themselves, they're having to crowdfund and maybe rely on restrictive fees from lawyers, dare I say, or even pro bono work. But those instances do come. So there are a number of cases that I have seen personally which have never made it to the doors of court, because even if a protective expenses order could be achieved, the costs of a party's own costs are just prohibitive in of themselves. Thank you.
Can I just ask us up on that? I talked about the Civil Litigation and Group Proceedings Scotland Act 2018 earlier. Has that had any meaningful positive impact in these considerations?
In terms of specifics, I need to go away and cross-check that, I'm afraid. But certainly I think probably as a general trend, what I would say is that I would have said in the last decade, because of protective expenses orders, we will have seen more cases come to the Court of Session for specifically judicial review than we might otherwise have seen. And so there is an increase, I would suggest, in the number of judicial reviews that have come forward. There aren't many. In terms of other cases, in my experience with the sheriff courts, these environmental cases are quite rare for sheriff courts to deal with. I think when looking at the timetable for cases, it's a sheriff court will have its range of general matters, civil and criminal, and some of these quite detailed environmental cases can take time, and there can be challenges post-COVID to fit them into diaries and such like. So I think there's still a lot of work and analysis to be done.
Thank you.
Sorry, just on that, so I can clarify. I mean, it sounds quite terrifying, the fees that could be racked up before you actually get to court, if you in fact decide to court. So by the time you've taken maybe QC's opinion, environmental QC's opinion, probably a second one, because the first one wasn't definitive enough, and the lawyers that require all of that, you're probably etching on to £30,000 just to get it to court. Is Is that way out of scope, or are we closer to £60,000 to get it to court? And then what is the fears that if you get it to court and you lose your case, that somebody then tries to reclaim their costs against you? Just give us an indication of what we're talking about, and that would perhaps let us understand why legal support may be required. Jamie.
Thank you, Convener. No, if I may, I think that's a very accurate best estimate. In my crystal ball gazing, if I was to suggest to a client who was perhaps going forward on a restrictive fee basis, if counsel was involved and solicitors involved, and when I'm practicing, because I'm based out of Edinburgh, I need to include an Edinburgh-based firm to deal with procedural work, I would have suggested that to deal with up to a one-day hearing at a judicial review, a party's cost would be in the region of about 30 to 35, 30 to 40,000, that sort of broad bracket. That would require a very focused judicial review. Now, the judicial review process has changed in the past number of years, whereby we have a much more focused front-loaded system, so that parties are lodging written notes of arguments to the court, and the corollary of that is hopefully to reduce court time. But cases can go on for multiple days. I can think of one case that was down for 4 days and ran for 14 days, and so there's a huge unpredictability of costs there. And picking up on your point, Convener, just about other parties' costs, if one doesn't have a protective expenses order, the broad rule is that expenses tend to follow success. So if a party was unsuccessful, they would be likely to face the costs of the government body they may have challenged. And then if a developer, for example, third party is involved, they may have legal expenses. So one could come away from a one-day exercise with a bill for, in the region of £100,000. That's not out of the ordinary.
Right. Well, I've just decided I'm not taking any of these cases. Bob, you want to come in, and then I'll go to Shivali.
Convener, can I apologise probably for a question back to Mr Whittle, which is probably stating the obvious, but I think it's maybe important to put it on the record. Deputy Convener mentioned a few matters that the government's taken forward to address the issues of cost, and I think it was Mr Austin or Shivali that said that doesn't guarantee that this will resolve matters, but the government's looking at various issues. Can you understand why the government's maybe treading very carefully in relation to this? Because as the exchange that Mr Whittle's had with the Convener, the significant exposure of the public purse in relation to all of this has to be a concern. I know it's not the concern that witnesses here today want to necessarily hear, but there's a significant exposure to Scotland's budget, depending on how we take some of these reforms forward. Is that a reasonable contention to put on the record, Mr Whittle?
I would suggest, thank you, I would suggest that, of course, costs in all shapes and forms have to be considered properly in litigation. I think I think costs in of themselves historically have been a deterrent to people being able to bring actions to court. I have seen judgment from the Court of Session which specifically referenced the fact that, and I think it may be that it was linked in with the Our House Committee, that litigation in the UK is considered to be generally more expensive than on the continent in Europe as a process. I suppose in terms of perhaps your point, sir, about the consideration for Scottish Government, I mean, with the protective expenses regime that one has at the Court of Session, there is a sifting process, so that there is a process for the court to consider whether or not a case has sufficient merits and prospects of success before it is granted a protective expenses order, and so there is quite a process to go through to be able to apply for one.
That was, I suppose, an extensive answer to what I thought was hopefully going to be a relatively brief question. And I just put a record, I think the Deputy Convener talked about the government wanting to enhance non-judicial routes to justice and remedy, the review of the protected expenses orders, the exemption of court fees from July 2022 and legal aid reform. I was merely, just as part of that conversation, do you appreciate the Scottish Government has to think about the cost on the Scottish public purse as it takes forward potential reforms? I think that was quite a straightforward question. I don't think I actually get an answer to that.
Well, I beg your pardon. I do appreciate that point, and that is noted.
Okay, thank you.
Justice costs, Shivali.
I think a couple of things. The Faculty of Advocates have actually said that that justice should be state-funded and that the court fee should be removed. So I think there is something around the human rights question here as well, that when all else fails, do we need to, should everybody else have access to the courts? So I think that there may be a cost, but hopefully, as Lloyd says as well, if it's a virtuous circle, just having the credible threat will up everybody's game and improve the quality of the environment. And again, if you think about different costs, I suppose, we would argue the balance between economic, social and environmental costs as well. So I hope the reluctance isn't because only of cost. Hopefully, if we get this right, there'll be less costs as well if we get the administration right and an environmental court or tribunal, if a specialist committee was established to look into the to whether that is the right way forward. I mean, of course, we believe it is, but I think only having that specialist committee to really consider all of these arguments can we properly answer your question.
I should maybe note that I spoke about government having to tread carefully because of the exposure of the public purse rather than a reluctance, and that's maybe why there's a bit of a prolonged period of consideration, but I suppose time will tell in relation to that.
Can I just...
We're very short on time, and I have to balance your right to give me an answer and the committee members' requirement to ask questions. So I am going to go to Mark, and maybe you'll get a chance to answer it when Mark asks his question. Mark, I think you've got some questions. Have you? Have I wrong-footed him? Or have we lost connection? On the basis if we've... Mark, did you have a question, a follow-up questions at all there? No. Okay, sorry, I did wrong foot you. My mistake. I was going to ask some questions on the Aarhus Convention, but I guess we've kind of covered it. I think the one concern that I've heard from today is making this more specialised. Once you make this more specialised, you get experts. Once you get experts, you get increased fees. And once you get increased fees, you go into a circle about whether you can afford to get the justice as well. I don't know if that's a problem. Sarah, you want to tell me that that's wrong, do you?
I would very much hope that an expert court would not lead to increased fees. I think the aspiration would be, and the evidence from many countries, that an expert court, because of its expertise, would expedite matters. And there's a much wider issue around access to justice generally and legal aid and that whole panoply of justice that doesn't just affect environment, even in its broadest sense. But I don't think that an environmental court or a specialist decision-making body would see an increase in costs. And I think ideally it would reduce costs by having that expertise built into it. So
the speed would save the fees, perhaps?
Well, expertise is really, really useful, isn't it? And if you have a system of bringing expert witnesses, some of that can be reduced by having an expert sitting in the court, both the judicial experts and in many environmental courts or tribunals, there's a scientific expert in the court as well. And I think that's one possible way ahead.
Okay, thank you, Bob. I think you've got some further questions and reflection on an earlier question as well.
Thanks, Convener, and thanks for the opportunity to do that. I was really interested in the line of questioning around how does ESS look at something as a systemic or systematic issue, because it can't deal with individual cases. And it got to me thinking a little bit more about how SEPA or Scottish Water would do that in the first place, because I could be wrong. I would have thought that SEPA see a pattern of complaints come in and investigations come in, Scottish Water similarly, and that those public bodies would do a significant piece of analysis on that and identify what is systemic, and therefore that's really vital information to inform ESS before anyone gets to ESS, because as we know, complainants have to go through Scottish Water or SEPA in the first place, exhaust all appeals functions there, and then to ESS. So what is that relationship developing? Because we must get to a stage where if Dr Fifiel's got a community group that she's supporting, that it becomes self-evident they are dealing with something that's systemic, and that can be evidenced by work that SEPA's done in advance or work that Scottish Water's done in advance. So what is that relationship looking like?
Do you want to start off first? Simon's nodding as well.
I will do, yes, thank you. So yes, you're right, we work constantly with communities and we understand how the impact of of how we regulate and it's having on the environment and on communities. We work constantly with Scottish Government about improving what we do, and very much we run along the lines that Sarah was saying, that it's better to get it right in the first place, and we constantly work with those we regulate as well as Scottish Government and the communities to make sure that we are having the right impact in terms of what's expected, in terms of the legislation that we operate under. So I think one of the things that we are learning about is having ESS and the Environmental Rights Centre now in the picture. And as I said previously, we are working much more closely with the Environmental Rights Centre. That is at its very early stages, but we are optimistic that that sort of more informal resolution and the feeding in of the concerns from that the Environmental Rights Centre pick out there in the community will help that process of constant evaluation and monitoring and improvement that SEPA is involved in terms of the way in which we approach our work.
So can I just double check before Professor Parsons comes in, because Professor Parsons could deal with this when he answers it as well. Bridget, are you saying that you would anticipate in the near future there'll be a clear understanding of environmental issues that are clearly going to be systemic, and while individuals and communities may have to go through your processes, by the time it gets to ESS there's an understanding almost before it gets to ESS that something will be deemed to be a permissible case for further investigation and potential enforcement because of the data and the information and the expertise and the national trends that SEPA or Scottish Water would see. Would that be anticipation going forward that would happen, Bridget?
I mean, I think ultimately the call is always for ESS about whether it's a systemic issue or not. But I think there is a closer working within the system of all the expertise. And I think one area that has been touched upon in the evidence but not developed is around that evaluation and monitoring about what is happening in Scotland's environment. And so previously we would have been in a framework within the EU where that evaluation and monitoring was undertaken by the European Environment Agency and the Commission. And I think that is still, post-EU exit, an area that we need to focus on again as people with an interest in the environment to work out how we understand those trends and share our expertise and knowledge. We do have information that is still available on SE Web, but I do think there is more that we can do about evaluating and understanding what's happening in the environment, which then, and the trends, which then makes ESS's role easier, that puts into context some of the complaints that come through from the Environmental Rights Centre and help bodies like SEPA understand how we can improve the interpretation of the law and the powers that we've been given to make that greatest impact on the environment. So there is, I don't think there's, as you suggest, that it will be straightforward, but all of this is in the early stages of development and there is more to do. And I think we need to do that collaboratively is largely my message today.
Okay, thank you. Professor Parsons.
Yeah, just to build on that and try and bring it into a real example, actually. So we talked earlier about the River Almond as an example on that one, and a big issue there is something called combined sewer overflows, the overflows that are built into our sewerage system to provide kind of relief valves out to the environment. So we have licences set by SEPA and we are compliant with those licences. So our role is very much to be compliant with those. But we recognise, and we've heard from others and in this committee previously, that sewer overflows are a growing issue across the whole of the UK. It's in the press very regularly. So we are very sensitive to that. So what do we do if we hear those and we have complaints or we have concerns raised by us? We work very closely with SEPA and the Scottish Government to understand the current picture and provide then a plan for improvement as part of that. And that's exactly what we've done with what's called our Improving Urban Water Route Map, which sets out our improvements over time for both monitoring, as Bridget's talked about, but also improvements into the environment. So that process works incredibly well here in Scotland, a lot better than anywhere else here across the UK. But it has a really well-structured approach about understand, identify, improve, deliver as part of that process. And, for me, success would be ESS don't actually have a role in there. I mean, because it's something going to ESS or the discussion we've just had about an environmental court would seem as a bit of a, if something for us went to an environmental court, we would view that as a failure. That is our failure to interact with our customers, our communities and key stakeholders before it gets there. So I think there's, for us, it's how do we identify those issues, how do we, identify a plan for improvement as part of that, without necessarily the need for a third party to do that. But fully recognise, the 250 complaints we've heard about earlier, there is a need for somewhere else for people to go and some opportunity for doing that, and we should all welcome that.
Okay, moving on now, Convener, to
we are quite pushed for time, but as you're the Deputy Convener, Ben, I will give way to you.
Thanks very much. And I think Professor Parsons made some important points there. There are instances, and I can think of at least one in my constituency, where public bodies and agencies are having to interact with private landowners. And is that not one of the areas of consideration where the use of legal mechanisms may be beneficial for the common good in certain circumstances?
Can I limit the answer to Simon on this and then come back to Bob, if I may?
100%. I think what you'll find across Scotland, and you'll be very aware of this, is public bodies work very well together. Our experience of working with SEPA, with Nature Scot, with other organisations, is we work together towards the common good of improving the environment for Scotland. And then, yes, in terms of in terms of the specifics in your consistency, we do need to work with public bodies, private organisations as well. The vast majority of those have got the same focus as well in terms of doing that, but they're often commercial and issues that we would need to address as part of those. The view that we'd need a legal route for doing that, I think obviously I think Lloyd used the word deterrent earlier, way I think is important, but again I don't think those private organisations wouldn't necessarily want to be going down, ending up in a court to satisfy something that is probably in the public good to do so.
Thank you. Bob, can I ask you for your last question, please? Okay.
Thank you, Convener. I hope I don't get shot down in flames by witnesses here, but having listened to the entire evidence session, Convener, it would appear as there's been and I sit in the Social Security Committee, so I understand the language I'm now about to use, there's been a safe, secure and successful transfer of powers to a Scottish level, but they're clearly imperfect, because they were imperfect before transfer, and from what I heard, any improvements have been modest at best. I think that's also reasonable to say. So I'm just trying to be balanced in approach. But we did hear from, I think, Bridget Marshall at SEPA that there's actually an additional scrutiny and focus that's been brought forward by ESS, and that there's a wider range of issues now being discussed and looked at, and indeed more localised ones. So that would seem to be something really positive that should be captured in today's evidence session. But we're not the only part of the UK grappling with this, and I'm conscious that in England there's the Office of Environmental Protection doing something similar. I understand that's all I've got in the tank in relation to what they're doing, I should say to our witnesses, for England and Northern Ireland. And in Wales, I'm just seeing here, there's an interim environmental assessor for Wales, which apparently is an advisory role back to the Welsh Government. So I suppose my question is, and just for maybe one or two witnesses, if there's something meaningful they can add, would be, where has Scotland done well vis-a-vis the other parts of the UK, and where are they ahead of us? Where can we learn from them for what we have to do better? Because this isn't in isolation. We should be learning from each other's experiences across the UK. So if someone gets something concrete and meaningful in relation to some of that, they could help our scrutiny today. Mr Austin, I think, is trying to get in.
Yeah, I think having gone through the whole EU exit process, the two things that Scotland has done well has been the introduction of the environmental principles and the establishment of ESS. But I think what we've been focusing on today has not been, we've noticed that that's happened. Those are two things that NGOs collectively were very keen on. And it's very welcome and a positive thing that has happened. But one of the reasons why Section 41 was included in the Continuity Act in the first place was to be able to ask the question, well, that having been done, was that enough? And I think that's why we've been focusing very much on the access to justice and environmental court aspects. But I think it's worth pointing out that those two things have been done. They've been done, as you say, in England in a slightly different way under the Environment Act 2021. They have the principles as well, and they have the Office of Environment Protection, which also covers Northern Ireland. And in Wales, there's a wee bit of a bigger governance gap than anywhere else. But in terms of other places, I think one thing that I would expect any next steps on the investigation of environmental courts to do would be to look at lessons from other jurisdictions. And as I mentioned earlier, there are over 1,000 jurisdictions with environmental courts around the world. And I think there are lots of examples in there. And one of ERCS's reports from Campbell-Gemmell did look at some of those examples, and I think there is a lot there that Scotland could learn from in other jurisdictions where environmental courts have been established.
I don't know if there's any other responses that may...
I see Jamie Whittle's raising his hand.
Mr Whittle.
Thank you, Convener. Just to add to those last comments, one thing I'd like to offer is that I think, well, there's two elements. I think one is that there's it's particularly important to note that the Scottish Government has clearly identified through the withdrawal bill the importance of maintaining high standards of environmental protection, and in my submission that should be applauded and recognised, that that level of standard is the aim to be maintained. I think another thing that runs in parallel is really since devolution, one thing that has stood out for me, certainly with legislation that has been created by the Scottish Government, is that there have been forms of legislation that have not necessarily had a European background, but which have been generated out of a desire to help protect the environment, such as the Nature Conservation Act for biodiversity, which doesn't have, in my knowledge, a parallel south of the border. So whilst I appreciate that many of the points raised today have been ones of critique of the paper that has been presented, I do think it's important to just remember that context of the high pedigree of legislation there is in Scotland. And what that does is it then sets the strategic mark for environmental governance to follow and make sure that that law is maintained and upheld, because we certainly have a vast array of environmental legislation there. Thank you.
And, you know, I'm just going to say that's the perfect place to leave it, because I saw everyone around the table nodding their head and in agreement. So it's always nice to end on a note of agreement. Can I just say thank you very much for your expertise. Our next step will be consider the evidence we've heard and to take further evidence from ESS at our meeting on I think it's the 5th of March. And we'll then hold an evidence session with the Cabinet Secretary for Transport, Net Zero and Just Transition at a meeting in the near future, after the government has published its response to the consultation. Now, I am going to ask you witnesses just to stay put while we complete the very short next item on our agenda, which is agenda item 6, which is the consideration of a negative instrument, the Bus Services Improvement Partnerships Local Services Franchise Provision of Information Scotland Regulations 2003. The instrument is laid under the negative procedure, which means that the provisions will come into force unless the Parliament agrees to a motion to annul it. No motions to annul have been lodged. Do any members have any comments on the instrument? I'm looking around the table. I'm not seeing that. So I'm going to invite the committee to agree that it does not wish to make any recommendations in relation to the instrument. Are we agreed? We are agreed. Thank you very much. That concludes our public meeting. I'm now going to suspend our private session for 5 minutes before we move on to the next item. So that concludes our part of the public meeting. Thank you.